Joining me as my special guest on the program today is Martin Armstrong from MartinArmstrongEconomics.com. And Martin, in December of 2010, the U.S. passed the HIRE Act, which increased reporting requirements for U.S. citizens holding assets overseas. It would appear to me, Martin, that step by step, the government is implementing programs of capital controls. Do you see it that way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're in a situation where the budget deficits are just blowing out, and it's going to get much worse. And so what's happening is that instead of dealing with the issues, the government's going to become much more aggressive to tax people, chase them down, imprison them. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, this new act that came in December 19th, effectively, they're telling any foreign corporation that they must report any activity with an American overseas. And they're going to do to them what they did to UBS. If they don't comply, they'll confiscate all their assets here. So honestly, from an international perspective, the best advice I can tell people is to get out. If you're going to do business in the United States, do it through an agent, but get your branch offices out of this country. It's going to get far worse.
It would appear this is something that happened in Germany under the Nazis, where they began to collect and find out where the assets were, and eventually, as we know in the case of the Jews, they confiscated them. But it seems like whenever you have a government that is trying to keep tabs of what you're doing, what you own, where it's held, that's a government that has intent of maybe taking some of it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the slogans tend to really mask the truth. And that is, they say, oh, the rich don't pay their fair share, etc. What this is really about is that only the United States and Japan tax worldwide income. So if your parents were, American and you happen to be born in Kenya or something, and you never come back to this country, you still owe taxes to the United States. So it's not a question of paying your fair share. An American is basically, when he's born, he's an economic slave, and you owe money to this country whether you're here, whether you receive any of the benefits or not. Whereas Europeans, they pay if you use the services. If you're going to stay in the country, then you pay taxes. A Brit who works in Hong Kong doesn't pay taxes back in Britain. He pays taxes in Hong Kong. Americans have to pay in both places. So it's one of the primary reasons why also U.S. companies are forced offshore, which the government doesn't like to talk about. But, for example, the Yellow River Dam in China, not one American company got any of the construction. Why? Because a German company is already 33% cheaper bidding on the same project than an American company because they earn the money outside the country. It's tax-free. Americans don't. So we really cannot compete on a global scale, which is one of the primary reasons why companies leave. And, of course, they don't want to talk about that. That's the reality of what we're facing here.
Throughout history, governments rarely reform themselves. In fact, whether you look at the Roman Empire, England under Charles I, France during the French Revolution, it seems like the powers of the state, as the state's debts expand, the powers of the state against the people also grow. Is this likely to happen here? I mean, it seems like little by little that's what's happening. Our rights in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, are being stripped away from us almost on an annual basis.
Well, essentially, the Bill of Rights is gutted already. There's nothing left. You just take the very simple thing, the right, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Okay, I mean, you can look at what they did basically to the Occupy Wall Street people, regardless if you agree or you disagree with them. I mean, they basically arrest them. They say, oh, well, you're walking on the grass. You're violating, and they say, well, we're not really violating your First Amendment rights. You violated some other minor statute over here. So this is how they get around everything. I just saw on the Internet that 40,000 new laws are being proposed for 2012 already. And this is crazy. God did the 10 Commandments. Man did about 10 billion laws. So, and we're trying to say the same thing at countless times, over and over and over again. But The Bill of Rights is gone. That's completely finished, and there is no question that somebody can actually protest, you need permits and all this other kind of stuff, so that's all out the window. And you can go pretty much down the line. Fourth Amendment, gone. Fifth Amendment, they basically have held that your right to remain silent, that's only personal. If you work for a company, which basically 99% of the people do, you don't have such a right because corporations don't have rights. So, I mean, you go right down the line. I mean, you look at this new bill that they just put in where the military can operate domestically, deny people counsel, lock them up, citizens now, all right? No right to go to court, no right to lawyers, no right to a trial. They can just hold you indefinitely until you die. And all under the pretense is, it's terrorism. Well, how do you know somebody is a terrorist? You have to have a right to, it's called due process of law. And due process of law actually comes from the Bible, and it comes from Genesis, when God basically says to Cain, where's your brother? He already knows supposedly what happened, but he's giving him the right, he's summoning him, and he's giving him the right to explain what happened, the right to be heard. That is the fundamental principles of due process of law. And this new bill says you do not have that. That we can just lock you up. You have no right to lawyers, no right to a judge, no right to a public trial, no right to even find out what they say against you. Nothing. So we're about as close as you can get to Naziville.
Well, on another issue, too, which is maybe why the government is doing this, we're seeing world economies start to crumble under the burdens of debt, and yet the government response is to expand government. In the U.S., it's gone from 18% of GDP on its way to almost 25%. We've seen increased regulations. You just talked about numerous bills being proposed for this year. And as they increase these regs and the size of government, taxation and regulations are strangling the economy. So instead of lowering taxes and reducing the size of government, they're going in the opposite direction. Government is getting more rapacious in terms of its demands on its citizens.
This is exactly how Rome collapsed. There was a Roman emperor, Maximianus, in 238. He simply declared all the wealth in the Roman Empire to be his. That's it. And so what happens, and what you're seeing and going to see over the next few years, as you attack the rich, as the Romans did, what happens is now somebody now hoards their money. They no longer invest it. They hide it. They don't keep it in banks. And consequently, that reduces the velocity of money. And as it reduces the velocity, that is what creates the economic decline. So that interest rates, even during the Great Depression, fell to 1%. Nobody would borrow because they didn't see an opportunity to make any money. And every possible mistake that every government has made before us, we are following step by step. And, I mean, you take the 2007 crisis. There were over 10 agencies regulating these CDOs. Not a single one was able to do anything. You look at MF Global. It's blown up. They stole basically almost $2 billion from people. The clearing exchange hasn't honored it. Nobody will do anything about it. The SEC, CFTC. We have all these regulators. What have they ever prevented? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And it's just a real giant joke. And the other problem that we are now facing and why government is rising exponentially is that as the baby boomers retire, this is also happening with government employees. So now they have to pay them virtually 100% of what they've been earning the last 3 years. Now they have to go out and hire somebody else to replace them. So the cost of government on the retirees is basically doubling. And there is no way out of this without some sort of honest reform. And government is not about to do it because largely, I think, well, historically, you're asking them they have to give up power, which they're not going to do. And additionally, we don't really have a democracy per se. You saw politicians stand up and say, oh, Saddam Hussein was a dictator and Gaddafi, they've been in business, they've been in power for 30 years. And then you look at these senators and you say, well, how long have you been down there? About the same amount of time. We don't really have choices. And whoever is sponsored by the party has to basically kowtow to the party. So it's very rare to find an individual like Ron Paul, for example, but the press tries to ignore him desperately. Why? Because he's not really part of the mainstream. So I don't see where we have any hope of doing anything. And because the politicians, we need term limits desperately. Because unfortunately, even if you want to say a congressman, increase the term to 4 years, fine. But one time, that's it, out and gone. I don't care who you put in as president. Obama's already spending the last almost half the term that he's in for preparing to get reelected for the second time. So it should be just one time only, that's it, for everybody. And then they're actually maybe going to do something that they should be doing without having to say, well, gee, I better not vote on this because I'm going to get elected. Maybe nobody likes that. So without serious political reform, we're just really screwed, totally.
This brings up the question of what has been referred to as the Fourth Estate, and that would appear, Martin, that we no longer operate in this country with a free press. In fact, I'd call it probably the government media, because its views, its readership is declining because of its bias and slant of how issues are either presented to the public or how issues are ignored. And that's the tragedy here, because our founding fathers always believed in a free press and the freedom of speech, that the media would be a check on government. Instead, they've become an arm of government. Isn't that another problem that we face here?
Yeah, the press is absolutely terrible. It's been going on for a while. When Michael Milken, back in 87, he was going to go to trial, and then they finally forced him into pleading. And not one American paper told the truth. The only paper that reported the full true story was the London Financial Times. Michael Milken, they first charged his brother, trying to force him to plead guilty. His brother said, don't worry about it, let's go to trial. Then they went after his 90-year-old grandfather and say, if you don't plead guilty, we're going to charge him. And not one of the American papers will ever tell the truth about anything here. It's just an absolute joke. We have a conviction rate in this country that is 10% higher than Adolf Hitler. That's alarming. The only person we